Okay, today I get a chance to speak with a person I consider a very close personal friend. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, but also one of the most entertaining. His name's Richard Dudas, and he used to work with me at Cycling 74. He no longer works there. He is now a world-traveling crazy man. He teaches in Korea, lives in Colorado. Go figure that combination. Hell of a commute. But in any case, let's say hello to Richard Dudas. Hey, Richard, how you doing?
Hello, how are you doing?
All right, man. Hey, thanks for taking the time. You are currently in Korea, so we are almost exactly opposite hours of the day, right? So it's like late evening your time, early morning my time, right?
Exactly. Thanks for the big introduction, the nice introduction. And yeah, it's like that's my life, is kind of like dealing with friends in Europe, friends in the US, and colleagues here, and having to deal with all this time zone change stuff. And like, oh my God, what time is it in London? What time is it in Paris? What time is it in Colorado? Miami, San Francisco.
Right. Your house must have like one of those rooms that's like in a Interpol shows or something, where it's have you like 6 clocks, London time, New York time, right?
That's actually on my computer when I do the remote control or mission control, and
right, yeah.
I have all the time zones out there.
So why don't we start off by having you tell people a little bit about all the different things that you do?
These days, I'm teaching music composition and computer music at Hanyang University in Seoul. And it's one of the big universities in Korea, usually ranked in like the top 10. So it's kind of like kind of like a Yale or Berkeley or something kind of school. It's not like, it's not like the University of no place. It's actually a big school, which means we've got a huge music department, a lot of kids applying, and we've got a grad program specifically in computer music, although in undergraduate it's just composition. So my main thing right now is I'm teaching the courses for computer music and composition lessons for the programs that we have there for composition undergraduate in computer music for graduates. And somehow I'm trying to find the time in doing all that and doing stuff like taking care of the studios, installing new versions of software like Max 8, and doing inventory and throwing away old things like some giant digitized controller hardware interface things that can't be used with modern operating systems. Somewhere in the middle of all that, and the bureaucratic stuff and the teaching stuff, I'm trying to find time to actually write my own music. And my own music is, I guess, I come from a more classical background. So I write classical music, but it's certainly not the classical music of, Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, or even that of Stockhausen and Boulez and Berio. It's going to be a synthesis of everything that I've loved in the music world throughout my life, and coming from different places, and I just write what I feel. I try not to think of what it is until it's done. But then with the computer part of it, my focus is actually working with solo instruments and computer interaction. Because I think if you've got a symphony orchestra, for example, you don't really need a computer, because you've got a giant synthesizer there with 200 people who can play all sorts of weird sounds or cool sounds or beautiful sounds or dark sounds. And so for me, in my own work, trying to give a solo instrument those kind of capabilities is a more interesting thing than trying to insert electronics with an ensemble or orchestra. So right now I'm actually working on a viola piece with computer interaction, as well as all the teaching and other stuff, bureaucratic stuff I have to do.
Right. Well, that's really kind of a remarkable introduction to your music, because one of the things that I would say about your work that I've heard thus far, I think it's you situated it well, which is that it's not necessarily an emulation of its precedents. It really does come across as a personal voice, which is really cool. But somehow you do something that I find really interesting, which is in a classical-like way, the work of yours that I've heard has been, I would say it's simultaneously beautiful and aggressive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I can kind of hear that. Yeah.
Right. I think that's interesting because it's almost like you're finding a way to carry on the dual nature, the duality of humanity, with some of this stuff, right? Where you're having to deal with beauty is really important, but if the beautiful stuff is just laid out there as it is, it sometimes seems like it can be kind of trite, right? And
right, exactly.
But you do something that adds, and I use the word aggressiveness, but maybe it's just like a level of complexity. I don't know. But it seems to really bridge that and make it so it doesn't seem trite. It doesn't seem saccharine. And I think that that's actually a remarkably difficult thing to do.
Yeah, no kidding. So aggressive, I see why you chose aggressive. The beauty is, I think, on the surface level. Mm-hmm. The aggressivity is not a musical aggressivity, but it's an audience aggressivity in the way that I'm consciously. So, for example, with this viola piece that I said I've just started, I'm in the middle of writing because I'm somehow inspired, and for a long time I wasn't inspired, and we can get into that later. The waves of creativity and how that intersects with technology, but in the viola piece, I'm imagining doing stuff where you have simple effects like a delay or an echo or something, and I want to sort of play with the audience's mind. They hear a delay and they expect it's gonna pan out a certain way. And then all of a sudden they're shocked because, oh my God, the computer, it didn't do what I just expected. And wait, what's happening? And wait, how did that happen? And
right.
So maybe I'm even thinking I want to do these little sneaky things slowly, one bit at a time, so that maybe some people pick up on it, some people don't. And as the piece progresses, slowly, statistically, everyone starts to realize what's going on. And I think that kind of attitude, it's not just this piece, but I think I tend to think that way. That's the aggressivity.
Right.
It's aggressively making people think about what's going on. And if you don't want to think about what's going on, that's fine. You can listen to that beautiful surface level.
Now let's talk a little bit about this idea of becoming or being inspired, because one of my experiences is that sometimes working in an academic environment and doing a lot of teaching, especially if there's a lot of student time, can actually make it really difficult to maintain your own personal artwork. And also, when you are working, you're doing this artwork for work, sometimes it can really hamstring your ability to also do artwork for art's sake. How do you manage that kind of issue? And especially with what sounds like a fairly aggressive teaching and student interaction kind of requirement?
I'm still looking for that balance. Maybe that's going to be a lifetime thing that I haven't, I don't know. I find it very difficult. When I first started my job here, which was actually one of my big jobs after leaving cycling. I guess it's when I first came here, it was part-time, and I was doing it part-time concurrently with Cycling 74. And then eventually I was offered a full-time job here. And so then that's when I became full-time here. So, which was actually a pretty smooth transition. It was a good transition. But after my first real full-time year here, I commented to a couple of friends in academia teaching at universities and other places in the United States. And I said, I feel like I've come here and I've done all these things, I'm doing what I want to do career-wise. But what's happening is I'm not doing any of my own work that I expected I would be inspired to do. And without hesitation, everyone just kind of laughed. And they said, you were expected to actually get your own work done your first year? And I realized, okay, I get it now. It's like, then I kind of realized, okay, there's going to be this constant balance of like planning enough stuff out ahead of time so you don't have to, so you have your own mental space during the semester. Like I said, I'm still searching for that balance. And I'm starting to think that I'm sort of fortunate in the way that I teach here during the spring and fall semesters, and then I go back to the US during our academic breaks. And that's sort of my time to get my own work done somehow. That's sort of my output time. And my input time is my during my teaching time, I just like don't try to output too much. I just try to accept input somehow and listen to lots of music that I like. That's kind of like, I think different composers, different people, different musicians, artists are different. Like Mahler needed that. Like Mahler, when he was conducting the Vienna Opera or the New York Philharmonic or whatever he was doing, his composing time certainly was not when he was being a conductor. His composing time was when the season was finished. He could go back to his little cabin in the woods and like just be surrounded by nothing but a piano and nature, that he actually got his own work done.
Right.
And I'm kind of thinking that might be sort of the model for me. Although, hey, it depends. Sometimes you're inspired and you get stuff done regardless of other commitments. And sometimes you are inspired but don't have time and have to wait.
Well, in addition, though, to your history of doing composition work, you have also engaged in really interesting work. Prior to your teaching gig in Korea, you were working for cycling for a long time.
Yeah,
and you were an important part of the DSP design work in the MSP part of Max, which was, there's an awful lot of those objects that carry your pedigree.
Yeah.
Before that, you were working at EarCam, right?
Correct.
That's kind of a pretty remarkable thing, and I'd like to talk about each of those time frames, but all of this stuff makes me want to ask the question that I like to ask people in my podcast, which is, how did you get to be this sort of like combination DSP magician, instructor, composer, performer, all these different things? Any one of them is a pretty tough task, and you've become very accomplished at many of them. I'm curious about your background. You're growing up, how did you become the person that you are?
I can start with like when I was like 2 years old. I really think that's where it begins. I have an older sister who's nearly 10 years older, who studied fine arts and who's an artist and painter and teaches. Actually she's retired now, but she ended up teaching in special ed and doing her own painting and creative artwork on the side. But when I was 2, she was realizing that she wanted to go into art pedagogy, and she was doing like, I said 8 or 9 years. I meant 18 or 19 years older. What am I talking about? She was out of high school and
good gravy.
And like in college when I was born. So
my.
I kind of messed that number up. Yeah. I was thinking, wait, she couldn't have been 12. But she was taking courses in like art and education and would come home and practice on me. And by the time she was out of college and doing like an internship being a high school art teacher, I was, 6 or something. And she would come home with these art projects that she was thinking of doing with the high school students, and she shoved them in my hands and say, do it. And it's like older sister says, you just shut up and do it.
Yeah, right.
I mean, looking back at it, it took me a while to kind of realize that I think a lot of my interest in making things in general, whether it's sound or art or programming, it's still making things. And I think a lot of that stems back to this sort of notion of like Big Sis coming in with some cool art project that seemed like a lot of fun and testing it out, me being her guinea pig. Yeah, so I think that's where it really started. And although later on I ended up doing music composition for my degrees in education after high school, that need to create things, not just music, but the need to make tools and the need to make stuff, whether it's food or whatever, was always the most prominent thing there in the background.
Right. Now, it's kind of interesting that your sister was so influential, and I think it also cracks a door open for me because of something that I've noticed is for people who, end up choosing sort of a career and a life in the arts, there's always somebody out there that makes it seem like, generally speaking, society tells us that it's not okay to do art for a living, right? That's generally the case with society. And so people who end up doing it, oftentimes there's one person that like cracks the door open for them, right? And for you, it sounds like your sister just like made it a thing that was like, well, of course you can be artistic for, for your career. And I think that that's actually a pretty powerful thing to have that like in the house.
Right. And the fact that she had her degrees in arts and like art education and ended up making that her life. I mean, she always did stuff.
Where did you end up going to college, and how did that get you aligned with working at ear camp? Because ear camp, for a lot of people, ear camp kind of represents a holy grail kind of a place, right?
Yeah.
How did you get there, and was it that for you at the time?
I think it probably was. Yeah, I think it probably was a holy grail. So let me back up. I ended up going to school, to university, to study composition. In high school, I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. Do I want to do math or law or music or what? And somehow, in this sort of period of indecision of what do I like, what do I want to do? And wow, I'm so young now. I have to make all these decisions and it's going to affect me next year. And I'm only 17. What? Help. I can remember one day we just kind of randomly got in the mail. We were getting because if you're involved in musical stuff like all state orchestra and who knows what, like piano lessons, somehow I guess music schools get your name somehow. So I was getting random brochures from colleges that probably had my list from a roster of like piano students in Florida or whatever. And one day, this brochure from the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, it's part of Johns Hopkins, it came in and it was really weird. I can remember, this is like years ago, but I can remember when that came in and I looked at it and looked at the school and looked at just looked at the student body and what was going on. It was really clear for me, that's where I want to go. And it was like this strange epiphany. Just seeing this brochure, it was like, that's the place.
Interesting.
And they sent it to me.
Right.
They don't even know who I am. And so I applied there and a couple of other places, and I was accepted there and one other place. And I think these days I see my students needing to apply to like 10, 12 universities of different levels just to kind of get in. And I feel, I don't know, maybe I just got lucky, or maybe the planets were aligned in the right way. I don't know what, but I basically, when I got it was just clear to me that that's where I wanted to go and that's where I was going. And I actually got in. I don't know how I got in, but I did.
Well, you had to go through the whole recital thing and stuff, right? Or the
audition process.
The audition process.
And I actually auditioned there on both piano and composition because I was taking piano lessons since I was a kid. And I can remember when I did the two auditions, I can remember leaving the piano audition and they all said, thank you, welcome to Peabody, thank you for coming to Peabody. And I felt really, really good about it. And then I did the composition one and I just felt like they were grilling me all these questions. And after that, I was just like, oh my God, I have no hope of getting in here on composition. But the piano faculty seemed to like me. And of course, the reality was like, I can't play piano worth shit. So it's like, no way they were going to take me. They were just being nice.
Right.
And I made it in composition. So it was interesting that when I did the audition, I really was like, okay, I've totally failed this one. And the opposite was true. So I think sometimes our perception of the situation is not so accurate. But basically, I got involved in computer music there at Peabody when I was an undergraduate. My teacher, Jean Ivey, was the founder of the Computer Music Studios, and she was actually on sabbatical my first year. I was working with someone else. I thought, well, if my teacher is doing computer music, I should at least see what this is about and take the intro to computer music class a year early. So when she gets back, I'll at least know a little bit of what she does.
Right.
And I did that, and I had a great time, and the rest is history. Then, when you finish college, at least I felt like, wow, I really still don't know anything.
Right.
And it's like you've got 4 years to kind of fill your brain up with, like, I don't know, a 5,000-year-old human history or more. And you can't. It's impossible. But you can at least learn the things that interest you. And so after that, I decided I wanted to go and study music. And this is all leading to EarCom. I decided I wanted to go study music more seriously, and I ended up going to Europe to just study. It wasn't a graduate degree. It was just like I want to just go someplace and study more traditionally and pick up all those little things that I really couldn't pick up because there were too many things going on, and there's holes in my knowledge, and I wanted to just go and learn things more traditionally somehow. So I ended up going to Budapest to study only composition. And then I ended up going to Nice and doing only computer music to kind of hone those skills each separately. And of course, somewhere along the way, I ended up going to, I knew about earcom since I studied computer music in undergraduate at Peabody. And when I was in Europe, I went to Paris at one point, and I can remember I went to earcom, to the front desk, and I didn't know anyone there. And I think they were doing renovations, so the front desk was like temporarily in the basement of the Pompidou Center. And I can remember going down there and getting to the front desk and asking the lady, I said, I'm visiting Paris and I do computer music, and I'd like, is it possible to visit your earcom? And she goes, well, no, it's not possible to visit, but if you know someone who works here. And she showed me the list of names, and I should have just randomly said, oh, him or her.
Right.
And I was too stupid to do that. Looking back at it, she was like, well.
She was trying to give you a hint, right?
She was trying to give me a hint, and it didn't click. I should have just said, oh, this person, or I should have anything. She was just trying to let me in.
Right.
And it didn't really click at the time, and I was being naive and nice and honest. And so I ended up not going to earcom and eating at some really cheap, fast food place around the corner because I was a student and that's all I could afford. But looking back at it, after I'd been to earcom and actually worked there years later, I realized, oh, that was Sophie who I met, and she was there. And now that I got to know her, since then I got to know who she was, and I realized, oh, she was trying to just shoo me in, and I was too stupid to let her do it. So then what actually got me to earcom was not just a tourist visit, but I was doing my computer music studies in Nice. I decided to do a project which was sort of a more technical project. So I was already using Max because I got into Max around 1990, 91 when it was first put out by Opcode. I heard about it at some workshops and I got it right away and was playing with it immediately. And so I wanted to do, this is back in the days before MSP, and I wanted to do audio processing, but there was no way to do it. I can go into details about the Max objects that I had to use, but basically I realized I made some kind of weird system that would write out a quarter second of sound and another quarter second of sound and save these little files on disk, and then I could convert it somehow and open it up in the equivalent of Pro Tools of the day, whatever I was using. Then glue them all together and synthesize sound in Max, but it was using metronomes and counters and stuff.
Right, sure.
And I realized I need to have some way of just writing out a sound file instead of just spewing out these numbers to text files and doing all this manual conversion and gluing quarter seconds of sound together.
Right.
So my professor there, Michel Pascal, he actually managed to get in touch with someone at the University of Nice who had a computer science student that was looking for a project. And so it turned out that we could collaborate and that I would help the guy learn how to write a Max object that would write sounds to disk. I was still using counters and metronomes and stuff and doing it. It was not at all, I couldn't listen to it until 7 hours later.
Right.
In doing that, I kind of ended up learning how to write Max objects and realized, oh, now I understand. I can do this. Mm-hmm. And that project, I think, is what landed me my job at earcom, because my jury was attended by some people from Paris, including Jean-Baptiste Barrière, who was in charge of the pedagogy at earcom. And not too long after that, I got an invitation to come up and visit, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon I'm working there.
What is some of the stuff that you did while you were there? Because my understanding is that the way it works is there's technical people are paired up with composition people or with researchers or whatever, and there tends to be sort of these working groups that attempt to accomplish stuff, right?
Yeah.
Were you part of one of those kinds of teams or several of those, or how did that play out?
Wow.
Or was that too simplistic of a discussion of it?
Okay, so My initial job at Earcom was a job teaching computer music. I was teaching Macs and teaching other stuff and learning all their software that that they make now. I guess that they distribute through the forum, the Earcom forum, which is the users group. So I was teaching it, and I guess that's what really got me realizing that, okay, I like this. This is fun to teach, and that's kind of where I got into the teaching thing, because I was hired there in the pedagogy department just to do classes in Macs and for a small group of students from around the world. So my initial job there had nothing to do with what we normally associate with Earcom. It was sort of doing weekend workshops about different pieces of software and teaching courses and mentoring students and helping them out in the studio when stuff wasn't working, although some of them may have had better studio knowledge than I had at that point in time. So at some point, my job split into two. They created the Earcom forum, which was the users group, and I got hired to be the sort of the forum guy.
Okay.
I was like a telephone hotline, but an email hotline, basically the person who is the go-between, who when questions from forum users would come in, I would get them and bring them to the right person and talk with that person and say, why doesn't this work this way? And then get explained that, okay, it does work, but the person doesn't know what they're doing, or, oh my God, they found a bug. So my jobs there were this sort of teaching and seminar kind of thing, as well as being sort of the tech support guy for the Earcom forum. But the tech support guy job went above and beyond just tech support in the way that I started making things. Mm-hmm. Some of the ideas I had to make things didn't actually get finished or realized until many years later, and eventually a lot of them got incorporated into Macs itself. But yeah, that's a complicated scenario, because the idea is that they pair up technical people with musical people to get things done. But it's a much more complicated structure than that. I spoke with a person who works there more recently, and I was saying something like, why aren't you guys writing papers for like the ICMC or these computer music conferences or NIME? And this guy said, wait, we're researchers. That's not our job. We're researching this stuff. It's up to the developers who take our research and implement it to write those things. So somehow it's not so simple as you've got the tech people and the music people, the art people, and you put them together and make a project. There are several layers of tech people with different focuses.
Sure.
And several layers of artistic people with different goals. And although people get paired up and people have an assistant to do stuff, very often the assistant is from a totally different sector, like a go-between sector, who's going to be interfacing between the researchers, the developers, and the artist. And so I was kind of that on a mini scale as the forum tech support guy. I wasn't necessarily working with the internal Earcom artists, but I was working with external Earcom software users who were using it for their own artistic work. And I was sort of like the interface person between the tech guys, either on the development side or the research side.
Okay, well, that helps me understand, though, a little bit more about you, because one of the things I always found remarkable is that you had a real breadth of knowledge across a lot of things. And my experience in the past had been that people that came out of Earcom, a lot of times they were really dialed in tightly with the artists that they had worked with, but didn't really know what anyone else was working. I can imagine, as being the forum guy, that put you in a position to kind of like see everything going on simultaneously, and was probably a neat way to get an overview of what was happening.
Exactly. And actually, that's where I learned everything I know. Seriously. It's like, because when I went to visit this person about that kind of software, we didn't just talk about that. I ended up saying, well, like, what are you working on? And they would explain to me stuff that I was far beyond my comprehension. But eventually, after a couple of years, you start understanding the complex stuff that they're doing. And yeah, it's interesting.
Kind of learn by osmosis, as they say, right?
Exactly. Learning by osmosis.
Right. At some point, you ended up transitioning to working with cycling. You must have been spending years then kind of with this forum work, kind of polishing your programming chops, right?
Maybe not polishing, but at least improving.
Now, David Ziccarelli came out with MSP in, if I remember right, 1998? Does that sound
97.
right? How early in the game were you involved with that? Because if my recollection is that you were kind of always involved with MSP, but that was before I joined the company. I'm just curious, where was your involvement with the MSP portion of Max?
When I started work at Earcom, Max 3, I think, was still in process, was still being worked on. And somehow through my Earcom connections, I got to be a beta tester for David Z. So basically, I was already testing. I was already one of his beta testers for Max 3 and Max 3.5. When MSP came out, I was one of the first beta testers to try it out. And actually, at the time, Earcom already had a audio processing version of Max running on the next computers.
It was particular to their kind of hardware cards too, right?
Exactly. They had these special cards that they had designed for audio processing on the next computer. At the time, people's personal computers were not powerful enough to be able to do audio. But by the end of the 90s, there were computers that were fast enough to be able to do this kind of stuff without some kind of special hardware card. So David Z made MSP, so Miller had named Max after Max Matthews, who inspired him when he was working on some of these ideas. And so David Z named MSP after Miller Smith Puckett, because that was the person whose ideas who inspired him. Exactly. And so I was one of the first beta testers, or even before beta. It was, I think David sent me the very first version before he'd even put a name on it. Then he said, would you be interested in testing some objects for me? It's a whole system. And I said, what is it? This is all by email. And he said, it's really nothing that special. So I said, oh, it's called NTS. It ended up being MSP. And so that's how I got involved with working on the MSP stuff. So basically, a few months later, David Ziccarelli had opened up Cycling 74. I mean, it was an online thing, although there was nothing yet that they were selling. And so he eventually then put out MSP. It became the Cycling 74 product. It was the first product of the new company.
So in addition to sort of like testing it, though, at some fairly early point, you got introduced to the DSP development on that, and you started creating objects as well, right?
Yeah. And that was, again, I think that was because of stuff that I wanted to do that I couldn't do. I felt there were all these cool things. Okay, so first, with the Next computers and the Earcom cards, they were fantastic, and I was glad to have the experience using them, but I couldn't go home and just play with it all night.
Right.
Because it was in the studio. Well, I could stay at Earcom and play with it all night, which happens sometimes, but it wasn't mine on my own little computer at home.
Well, because those cards cost like the amount of a car, right?
Something or more. I mean, I don't know. It was crazy, but that's what high tech costs.
That's what it was at the time. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I think Max Matthews did a presentation at one point when he was still alive about the relative cost of your laptop and what one of these mainframe computers that filled up rooms and rooms and rooms of some research center cost, and how slow those were compared to like how super fast your laptop is, and how things have really, really changed in 50 or 60 years. So the Earcom workstation, it was like it cost a lot of money. I couldn't afford a Next computer, let alone afford one of those cards. They were really sold not to individuals but to research centers and studios, because that's who could afford that kind of high tech. And at some point, the computers got fast enough that you didn't need these specialized cards. So I guess when I started working for Cycling 74, I was interested in working on the audio stuff. I guess with my old project of writing sound files to disk, I'd already had this interest in that. But I was thinking, for my own music, what do I need? And somehow all the tools that weren't there that I thought I might need to do my own music, when I eventually got around to doing my own music with Max, those were the things that I concentrated on making.
This is kind of an interesting direction to talk, because this idea of making your own tools, it's something that we're kind of coming back to now because of the availability of tool making stuff like Max and Reactor and PD and Chuck and all these things, right? Super Collider. But for a long time, and especially when you were doing it, this was not the norm. Most people had to wait around for the tools to get made for them. Having the ability to do that probably put you in a fairly unique position among performer composers. How did you take advantage of that? Or did you?
I don't think I took advantage of it right away. I think I kind of always joke that, like, I'd used Max for 15 years before I dare to even do my own piece using it. I think the problem is I was very comfortable with little tasks, and those are great, and it was great making help patches and little demo patches. But when you have to do a whole functioning Max patch that runs a piece of music with lots of little details, it's a lot of work. It's a lot more than just opening up that like cool example patch from the Max examples and playing with it. There are people who can open up those patches and change the parameters and improvise and like spend hours and maybe come up with something that's like really engaging. But somehow for me, I don't know, I had different musical goals. I wanted to put more detail into my stuff. And so I think I was very daunted by the fact of how much work is involved. And I still am. I wrote that piece in 2005. Actually, I wrote the piece in 2001, but didn't actually make the Max patch until 2005. I had it all planned out, and then I kind of like, wow, I can't do that yet because, for example, there was no way to transpose the sound that sounded good enough to me. So I made the Gizmo object to do that. Finally, everything's in place, and I realized, okay, my tools are in place. I had an opportunity. I just shut everything off and did that. And do you want to know what? That I'm still not finished with that stupid piece because it rears its ugly head every time I have to do an update for a new version of Max, or I have a friend who wanted to record it, and he wrote me this huge email and said, okay, I'm like going to record the piece, but before I record it, I want you to fix this and this and this and this. Here in measure 5, there's like this bump and the electronics shut off abruptly. And here things go thud. And here stuff doesn't work. And this doesn't really work right. And there was like pages and pages of things to fix. And I had to go through, I spent like 2 weeks going through this little 5 patch for a 5-minute piece, trying to just get everything so that it worked smoothly and so the performer is happy and they feel like they're playing with another performer is a duet instead of with some glitchy computer. I'm still not finished with that piece, the never-ending update. I don't particularly like that aspect of it, but I'm resigned to the fact that that's just what I'm going to have to live with if this is what I want to do.
And I wonder, though, if that isn't one of the difficulties of modern composition, especially computer music composition. First of all, unlike Mozart, you don't scribble a bunch of stuff on paper, shoot it out the door, and clap your hands and have a meal, right? Exactly. When you make a thing and you release it to public, in a way, you're telling all the future people that are going to work on this, well, if you need customer support, drop me a line. There's going to be this constant thing where the programs that you're depending on change. The computer languages that you wrote it in are going to change. The operating systems of the devices, or the way, I was involved in a show that was doing visual artwork, and it was like doing a lot of older pieces. And some of it depended on very specific hardware, like a certain kind of monitor for a computer that would glow in a certain way. That was a critical part of the way that the piece worked, right? So now all of a sudden, part of the production of or the display of the piece was like trying to source an old Sony monitor, right? Doing these kinds of things, artwork becomes really complex when it becomes tightly tied to the circuitry and the implementation of electronics that was used to make it.
Yeah. that opens up a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, you are kind of in the midst of it because you have what ends up being a living and breathing entity, not really just a composition.
That's a perfect reason for an institute like EarCom to exist. They commission all these pieces with technology. As the technology changes, they have a whole team of people who are there to keep things updated and keep things running when they need to. I mean, as much as is humanly possible. I mean, you can't do it for everything. So that's where that's like a huge need, because like the individual composer can't always do that.
Well, that's kind of one of the things their pedagogy department, though, is working on. And I think it's interesting, even the changes when you were there. Pedagogy was like collecting all the stuff that people were doing and storing it and then helping develop some more, right? Now it sounds like a big part of what they're doing is making it so all the stuff that they collected still sort of works in some way.
So that's the creation department that does that. The pedagogy is strictly teaching workshops, although there is some overlap because the pedagogy department is involved in doing some creation, doing some concert production stuff. I guess production that's a different department too. But creation was, like you said, their job was to make stuff. But then at a certain point, they had a dual job to make stuff and to revamp stuff.
Maintain it, right?
Maintain it. And at one point, there were different people working on the maintenance stuff than there were actually doing the new productions. And I think now there's like overlap. Some people will do a new production, but then have to go back and revamp something to make it work again after 10 years. At the beginning, you didn't need to revamp.
Well, you didn't even think about it. You were so worried about trying to make something work.
Yeah.
Well, as a composer, does that ever give you pause? Almost like it's like, I don't know if I want to go down this path because I don't want to have to maintain it. You know, do you ever find yourself getting caught with that?
And that kind of brings us back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the thing. I said, I had this long sort of creative lapse where I felt I'd only written a few pieces with electronics. Mm-hmm. And then I actually did a few things that I was not so proud of, rehashing old ideas. And so I stopped. And part of that was I started realizing I need to maintain things and I needed to put an energy into maintenance. And I'm sure part of my lull in creativity on the electronic side had to do with realizing, okay, the more I make, the more I have to maintain.
Right.
At a certain point, you just realize, okay, I have to just make stuff, and I have this idea and I want to get it out, and who cares? Forget it. It's like, forget about what you're going to have to do and just do what you have to do now. And hopefully someone will deal with the maintenance for me in the future when I don't want to deal with it anymore myself.
What it does then too is it also does point to something else that's kind of important, which is actually creating documents or artifacts of these works rather than just the patches. I think one of the things that's too tempting, whether we're talking about max patches or analog synth patches or whatever, is to look at the patch as the artwork. And I think that's where we get into kind of like some scary ground, because that can stop, and it's hard to think of art stopping, a piece of art stopping. And so all of a sudden then it makes me wonder if the actual artwork isn't an artifact or a recording or a presentation or something, and not the patch itself.
I think when you deal with performing arts and music in particular, that's an issue because, for example, if you have a painting by Botticelli, the art is the artifact.
Right.
And the fact that he painted that painting and it's in a museum and people have seen it for however many hundreds of years, there's no question about that. That's the painting. And if someone else decides to repaint that or do a variation of it or do a reinterpretation of it, then it's this person's reinterpretation of Botticelli's whatever. But in the music and performing arts world, I say performing arts because it extends to theater pieces, to anything that has to do with a time-based performance. You create the music and then you give it to other people to make. So the artifact There is no artifact. The artifact is the performance. It's not an artifact. The music exists when it's being performed. The theater piece, the Shakespeare play exists when people are on stage doing it. And yeah, they're going to do the Shakespeare way differently now than they would have in like 1602. They're going to play Bach way differently than Bach may have played his own pieces. And is your musical score, your notation on the page, that's not the artifact. That's the instruction manual.
Right.
There is no artifact. And that's kind of a weird thing to think that, okay, well, all these artists are making sculptures and paintings and Banksy is like shredding his stuff at the guy. And I can't shred my music. If an orchestra is playing it, it's out of my control. And I can shred the score, but they might still be playing it.
Right.
It's like our score, our musical, the artifact that we create is not the final product. The artifact we create is the instruction manual on how to make the final product, and it's up to other people to make that final product. And on some level, if you look at that in the Max Patch world, the Max Patch is not the artifact. It's the instruction manual for the computer and the interface between performers or the people doing it. And just to backtrack a little bit, when you get to the history of recorded music, then you start having artifacts like Ellington, just to name someone, one of the many people who recorded over the past century. Ellington. So if you hear something like Sophisticated Lady, and there are multiple versions, which one of those Ellington recordings is the real one, first of all? Because already there are different recordings of him playing it with different bands and different singers. Is it the Rosemary Clooney version, or is it the Ella Fitzgerald version, or which version of Sophisticated Lady is the real one? Well, there is no real one. But then, if someone else apart from Ellington is going to be doing Sophisticated Lady, then is it So is it still Ellington's? Yeah, it's still Ellington's music, but it's not. But we still think of it as, they're doing a cover of Ellington or something. It's like, so because we have this recording of the composer doing it somehow, we have an artifact. And is that necessarily good do we need to do it slavishly the way Ellington always did it? Certainly we don't do Bach the way Bach did it, or Beethoven the way Beethoven did it. So do we have to always do Ellington the way Ellington did it? Why can't we put our own spin on it? So that actually, in the Max Patch world, why do we need to use that Sony monitor? That's not the Max Patch world. In the Max Patch world, why can't we, I don't want to say make things better, but why can't we take existing music and do it a little bit differently? Because that's interpretation thing. I don't know. So I feel that the music is not the Max Patch for me. The Max Patch is a means to the music, but the music is something that is going to be created on stage hopefully by people, by a computer, but the Max Patch is still the roadmap for the computer.
Sure.
Or the person to follow to create the thing.
Right. Very interesting thought. So, man, our time is kind of long gone already, but I want to check in with you on one other thing before I let you go. You are now situated in Korea, but you've also been involved in creating conferences in the area and stuff that would have drawn people in from all around, all over Asia, to sort of like interact about computer music and computer-based composition and stuff like this. What is the community like there, and how does it differ from what you saw in the U.S. and in Europe?
I think the word that I most use to describe the computer music scene here is young. And I don't just mean in terms of the age of the people doing it, or the age of the studios, or the age of the festivals. I mean, in the youthful exuberance somehow, even older people have. This is a perfect example. One of the senior composition faculty who is now teaching at Seoul National University, and I believe is due to retire at some point soon, who was the founder of our studios at RU University originally, who was one of the people who brought computer music ideas back from Europe in the late 80s, early 90s, and helped establish the Seoul International Computer Music Festival, is this guy named Donung Lee. Like, he's near retirement, but he has a sense of fun and play with computer music. Like, I met him once and he was like, this is when Max 5 first came out. He's like, I got Max 5 and I've been playing with it, and I've like made this fractal thing, and here's like, it's like he still has this sort of, he's no longer one of the kids.
Right.
But he has that young attitude toward computer music.
Still very excited, right? Yeah.
Still very excited. And I feel that's a general thing, even though maybe technology these days is, as we've discussed, is commonplace. People have basically a supercomputer in their pocket on their mobile device, but somehow being able to use that for things that are more artistic and creative are still fun, even though, so maybe sending someone a text message is not so fun, or, it's not fun, but it's just commonplace. But like actually creating something, whether it's like, making sounds and putting them in tracks, or improvising with Live or whatever software you use, or using Super Collider or Max, or live coding with Chuck. That's maybe the fact that technology is so commonplace means that when you can use it to do something creative, it suddenly becomes fun. I don't know. Maybe that's the inroad there. But I feel there's sort of an exuberance here about new things and about trying stuff out. And it's not just in the academic world. I think that's sort of more even there's a whole sort of underground music scene here in Seoul with a bunch of noise artists, people who do circuit bending stuff, as well as people who do computer-based improvisation with noisy sounds. Again, there's that same kind of attitude of like, oh, we're making some new, fun, cool art, and there's sort of it's totally non-academic, but both worlds share this sense of, oh, we're making something new.
I hear it, man. Well, that sounds really interesting, and it seems like you're sitting in a very enjoyable spot, both as a teacher and as a composer, to be informed and inspired by the work that you see.
Mm.
Richard, our time is up. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to have this chat. It was really great to get caught up, and I learned a little bit about your background, that even though I've known you for 20 years, I'm always still learning about my friends, so that was really great as well. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thank you for interviewing me. It was a pleasure to be there and be here, wherever here is.
Right, indeed. Well, with that, we'll say goodbye. Have a good one.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Good morning. Happy snowy Sunday morning. I'm actually in a hotel in Minneapolis. The snowstorm prevented me from getting home. Plus, I had a little harrowing adventure with the airplane, which included having to go into full-on grab your knees and pray mode flying into town. So I'm having a great weekend. I hope yours is doing a lot better than mine. I want to thank Richard for the chat. It was really great to have a chance to catch up with him, hear what he's been doing now that he's in Korea. Fabulous guy, and looking at all of the variety of work that he has out there is really going to be kind of in your best interest. I want to thank everybody who has been so helpful with the podcast, the people at Syntopia, my friends at Cycling 74. And I also want to have a shout out to the people out in North Adams, Massachusetts, who I hung out with this last week. It was really great to see you all, and can't wait to get out there for some upcoming activities. So with that, I'm going to let you all go. Have a great one, and I'll catch you next week.